When I was getting divorced, I voluntarily gave up custody of my daughter. It was because on the day we went to court to file for divorce, she clung to her father's neck and cried, bad mommy, I hate mommy. If you insist on divorcing daddy, I'll stay with him and let you grow old alone." In my previous life, I ignored her childish threats and fought for custody anyway. I raised her with everything I had, every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every dream I quietly folded up and put away so that hers could breathe. But she hated me her whole life. Never called me mom again until the day I died. On her wedding day, she invited her father's mistress onto the stage to give a speech of thanks, handed her a bouquet of white roses, and wept like the woman had saved her life. I sat in the back row, next to the kitchen door, listening to the applause, and I died 3 months later with her name the last word on my lips. I was a fool. A spectacular, devoted, world-class fool. So, when I opened my eyes again, truly opened them, gasping like someone dragged out of deep water, and found myself standing in that same courthouse hallway with the same flickering fluorescent light, and the same smell of old coffee and floor wax, I understood immediately what had happened. I had been given something back. Time, and I was not going to waste a single second of it on people who had already shown me exactly who they were. When Annie looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes, her face twisted into that expression I now recognized as performance rather than pain, and screamed that she hated me, that she wanted to stay with her father, that I should grow old alone. I felt nothing shatter inside me. No icy pit, no despair. I simply looked at her the way you look at a weather forecast you already knew was coming. And I nodded. "Fine by me," I said clearly. "I don't want an unlikable child anyway." The silence that followed was exquisite. Jack, my soon-to-be ex-husband, the man who had spent 2 years funneling our joint savings into an apartment he shared with his 24-year-old girlfriend while I managed the household, raised our daughter and worked full-time, stared at me like I had just spoken in tongues. Annie froze mid-sob. Her mouth stayed open, but the sound stopped, and for one strange, almost funny moment, she looked exactly like a fish. Then Jack recovered and started cursing at me, telling me I was out of my mind, that no decent mother would say something like that in front of a child. I let him talk. I had spent 11 years letting Jack talk, nodding along, smoothing things over, apologizing for disruptions I hadn't caused. I was done. When he finally ran out of steam and nudged Annie to look at me, expecting me to crumble, to reach out and gather her up and beg her to choose me, I simply held my purse a little tighter and said, "I mean it. If she doesn't want to be with me, that is completely her choice, and I will respect it. I don't beg. Not her, not anyone." Then I walked to the clerk's window and signed every document they put in front of me, including the one waiving my claim to primary custody, without a single tremor in my hand. What nobody knew, what I had spent the first frantic weeks of my second life quietly arranging, was that I had already consulted a forensic accountant. In my first life, I had been so consumed by grief over the divorce and the custody battle that I had never looked closely at the finances. I had simply accepted the settlement Jack's lawyer proposed, walked away with the smaller car and a modest monthly payment, and considered myself lucky to escape. This time, I had done my homework. 3 weeks before we set foot in that courthouse, I had handed a box of bank statements, tax returns, and credit card records to a woman named Gloria Chun, who was widely considered the most feared divorce attorney in the city and who had a reputation for making men like Jack wish they had simply been honest from the beginning. Gloria had gone through those documents like a scalpel through butter, and what she found made her sit back in her leather chair and smile in a way that did not reach her eyes. Jack had not just hidden money. He had hidden a second business, registered under his girlfriend's name, funded almost entirely by our marital assets over the course of 4 years. We were not dividing one life. We were dividing two, and I was entitled to a significant piece of both. The settlement we eventually reached, after Jack's initial smugness collapsed into panic, and then into a very long and expensive legal negotiation, was nothing like the one I had accepted the first time around. I walked away with the house, a proper share of his investment accounts, and a lump sum payment that made my mother cry when I told her the number. Jack walked away looking 10 years older and quietly furious, which suited me fine. He had his girlfriend. He had Annie. He had made his choices. I had made mine. What I had not anticipated, though, was how aggressively the universe intended to complicate the neat future I had sketched out for myself. The first twist came 6 months after the divorce was finalized, when Annie called me. I almost didn't answer. We had barely spoken since the courthouse. Jack had primary custody, and he had made it easy for Annie to fill that silence with resentment, telling her, according to mutual friends, that I had abandoned her, that I had chosen money over my own child, that my coldness was proof I had never really loved her. I had expected this. In my first life he had done the same thing and it had worked magnificently. But something in Annie's voice when I finally picked up was different from anything I remembered. She wasn't crying. She wasn't accusing. She just said, very quietly, "Mommy, I think something is wrong with Daddy." I sat down slowly on my kitchen floor and asked her what she meant. What followed was 15 minutes of halting, careful sentences from a 7-year-old trying to describe something she didn't have the vocabulary for, and by the end of it my hands were shaking. The girlfriend, the woman Jack had left me for, the woman Annie had been living with for 6 months, had a temper. Not the door-slamming, voice-raising kind that was ugly but survivable. The other kind. The quiet kind. The kind that left marks in places that were easy to hide and explanations that almost made sense if you didn't look too closely. I called Gloria Chen before I even stood up off that kitchen floor. Then I called a child psychologist I had researched in advance because, in this second life, I had tried to prepare for every possibility except, apparently, this one. Within 3 weeks, with the help of a social worker, a very thorough pediatric examination, and Annie's own careful testimony delivered in a room with soft lighting and a bowl of goldfish crackers, Jack lost primary custody entirely. He didn't lose it to me, not immediately. He lost it to a court order and a supervised visitation schedule, and a look on his face in the hallway outside the courtroom that I felt guilty about finding satisfying, and then stopped feeling guilty. Because Annie had come to me the weekend before with a bruise on her ribs she had been told was from falling off a bike she didn't own. Annie moved in with me on a Tuesday in November, dragging a rolling suitcase covered in star stickers and refusing to meet my eyes in the car. I did not push her. I did not make speeches or demand gratitude or remind her of anything she had said in that courthouse hallway. I had her room ready. Not the one I thought a little girl should want, but the one she had described to me in fragments over our cautious phone calls, with yellow walls and a shelf for her rock collection and a reading nook with a cushion she could pull the curtain on when she needed to be alone. When she saw it, she stood in the doorway for a long time without speaking. Then she dragged her suitcase inside and didn't come out for dinner, and I left a plate outside her door and went to bed and told myself this was enough for one day. It took 4 months for her to call me Mom again. It happened on a random Wednesday morning when she was annoyed that I had bought the wrong brand of cereal, and she said it like it meant nothing. "Mom, this is the one with the weird aftertaste. I told you," and then went back to her bowl like she hadn't just rearranged something fundamental in the room. I turned back to the stove so she wouldn't see my face, and I stood there for a moment with my eyes closed and just breathed. I was not going to cry over cereal. I absolutely cried over cereal. The second twist, the one I genuinely did not see coming even with the advantage of a life already lived, arrived in the form of a letter about 14 months after the divorce. It was from a production company. In my previous life, I had spent years working in marketing for other people's ideas, quietly filing away a product concept I had developed during Annie's first year, something I had never had the time or money or confidence to pursue. In this second life, with the settlement money and the psychological freedom of someone who had already watched herself make every fearful, self-sacrificing choice and seen exactly where it led, I had built the thing. Just built it, imperfectly and stubbornly, working in the kitchen after Annie went to sleep. A children's organizational app, simple and colorful, designed around the way kids actually thought rather than the way adults wish they did. I had launched it quietly. The letter was from a company offering to acquire it for a number that I had to read 4 times before it resolved into something real. I called Gloria Chen again, this time to recommend a contracts attorney, and I sat across the negotiating table from 3 men in expensive suits who had clearly expected someone easier, and I watched their faces cycle through surprise and recalibration and eventual grudging respect, and I signed on terms that were entirely mine. Jack heard about it, of course. It was the kind of thing that travels fast through a shared social network, And within a week, a mutual friend texted me a screenshot of something Jack had said in a group chat. Something bitter and revisionist about how he had always supported my ambitions, had always believed in me, had been the real backbone of our household while I built my career. I screenshotted it, saved it, and did nothing with it, because I didn't need to. Annie was 11 by then, and deeply, quietly observant, the way children are when they have learned that the adult world is not always safe, and she had already started forming her own conclusions about her father without any editorial assistance from me. When he tried to take credit for my success at a school event, standing beside me with his new girlfriend noticeably absent, smiling at the other parents like we were still a unit, Annie looked up at him with her rock collector's flat, assessing gaze and said, "But you didn't even know about the app until it was on the news, Dad." The silence was even better than the courthouse one. I hid my smile behind a cup of terrible school event coffee and said nothing at all. The last thing, the quietest and in some ways the strangest, was that I did not hate any of them the way I thought I would. Not Jack, not his girlfriend, not even the version of Annie who had screamed at me in that courthouse and spent a wedding seating me next to a kitchen door in a life I no longer lived. Anger had carried me through the first year, had been the engine I needed when grief would have stopped me cold. But somewhere between the cereal and the contracts and the Tuesday evenings when Annie spread her rock collection across my coffee table to explain the difference between igneous and sedimentary like I was a particularly promising student, the anger had burned down to something smaller and more manageable. Not forgiveness exactly. More like indifference to the past and a ferocious, almost violent interest in the present. I had been given an extraordinary thing. A chance to meet the version of myself that stopped apologizing for existing and started just existing, loudly and on her own terms. I intended to keep her. Annie is 30 now. She still has a talent for being annoying and a fierceness that occasionally makes my eye twitch in a way of stating uncomfortable truths without warning that I recognize, with some discomfort, as entirely mine. She calls me mom like it's a fact of nature. Last week she asked me, out of nowhere, if I ever regretted the divorce. I thought about it honestly and told her no. She chewed on that for a moment and then said, "Good, me neither." Then she went back to her rocks. I looked at her across the coffee table and thought about that courthouse hallway, that fluorescent light. That woman I used to be who would have burned her entire life to the ground just to keep a child who had already decided to leave her. I thought about the back row at a wedding. I thought about cereal and contracts and a yellow room with a reading nook and a curtain she can pull closed when she needs to be alone. Then I went to make dinner, and I didn't think about it anymore.